Okay, in this lecture, we're going to look at the relationship between philosophy and science. Because this class is a philosophy of science class, so it's not a science class, but it's a class about science. Kind of, but it's a philosophy of science class. It's not a history of philosophy class, a sociology of science class. It's not an anthropology of science class. It's not a class on the economics of science or on the poetry of science or dance in science. So we're gonna take a little bit closer look at just what is the relationship between philosophy and science, and why there should be a philosophy of science to begin with, and also why scientists should maybe concern themselves with the philosophy of science as well. So let's just kick it off. This is something I hear a lot from scientists. Hey philosophers, who do you think you are? We scientists, we're doing important things like curing cancer. But aren't you philosophers just a bunch of humanities folks with your liberal arts degrees? What are you going to do with that philosophy degree anyways? Become a barista? I get the stereotypes. In fact, philosophers tell many of those jokes ourselves. We like the self-deprecating humor. But yeah, aren't philosophers just a bunch of hippies? Philosophy's easy. Just, drop some acid and see what cosmic ideas come to you with your buddies. And then maybe, do a little bit of hippie dancing. All right, I get it. But on the contrary, this negative attitude towards philosophy, especially from, I guess you could say, the hard sciences or the sciences in general, this is a new attitude. It hasn't always been around. In fact, if you study the history of science, you realize that scientists actually had a great appreciation for philosophy and relied a lot on it. So you probably know who the gentleman in this picture is. That's Albert Einstein. And in a letter he wrote in 1944 to Robert Thornton, Einstein wrote that a knowledge of the historic and philosophical background gives that kind of independence from prejudices of his generation from which most scientists are suffering. This independence created by philosophical insight is, in my opinion, the mark of distinction between a mere artisan or specialist and a real seeker after the truth. But who does this guy think he is? Einstein? But the fact is, Einstein wouldn't have made the contributions to physics that he made, contributions that we still benefit from today, were it not for his philosophical education. And his continual, engagement with philosophy. And if you read his letters, you could, and also just his published writings, his journal articles and stuff. I mean, the influence of philosophy on him is everywhere. And he never denied it. And so during Einstein's time, that wasn't really something to be embarrassed of. So anyways, this isn't a class on the philosophy of physics or the history of the philosophy of physics, but if you were to take other classes at Mason, like maybe early modern philosophy, or you learn more about this stuff. So in the past, there were tight links between science and philosophy. The gentleman to the top left is Rene Descartes. He's a philosopher who's famous for saying, "I think, therefore I am," but he was also a mathematician who, you've probably heard of Cartesian coordinates. Well, that's Descartes. He was also a physicist, and he did a lot of medical research as well. This was back in the day when you could be a polymath. The gentleman to the upper right is Galileo. Probably heard of him. Gentleman in the bottom left is Isaac Newton. And then in the bottom right, I believe that is Huygens. So these are all Enlightenment scientists and philosophers who wouldn't have been able to make the contributions to science they made were it not for their were it not for philosophy as well. But today, many well-known scientists perceive philosophy as different. And not just different, but maybe antagonistic to science. Stephen Hawking, Neil deGrasse Tyson, and at the bottom is a physicist named Lawrence Krauss. They've all taken, I guess you could call them pot shots. They've kind of thrown some shade at philosophy. So, are they right, or are these guys right? We're going to look at that in this lecture. We're going to look mainly at, first off, what is the philosophy of science, and then we're going to look at a view called scientism, which is the view that basically all you need is science. You don't need philosophy or any other way of exploring the world. And we're going to probe that And then we're going to look at more carefully just why science needs philosophy. Or does it need philosophy? And if it does, why? So, what is the philosophy of science? You're going to be doing a lot of philosophy of science in the coming weeks. So you'll get a better understanding of what philosophy of science is when you start reading and engaging in philosophy of science yourself. So this will be kind of like a high-level view. But broadly, philosophers of science will analyze various methods of scientific inquiry, and they'll also analyze the assumptions that scientists make. And scientists make lots of assumptions. And as we'll see later, many assumptions that scientists make are philosophical assumptions. And again, also, when you're critiquing various types of scientific methods that scientists use to explore different questions, oftentimes you're engaged in philosophical reasoning. So, why is philosophy of science the philosophy of science? Well, it looks at more general issues than I guess you could say specific sciences. It looks at the kind of fundamental character of science. And there's also, we need to compare the philosophy of science to, say, other fields like the history of science or the psychology of science. Philosophy of science is empirically informed. Philosophers of science, we try our best to keep up to date with the latest developments in the science. Many of us have degrees in sciences. We read the publications that scientists write. We interact with other scientists. We are up to date. And the empirical sciences inform the work of philosophy of science. But that doesn't mean that empirical solutions, scientific, resolve the questions that philosophers of science ask, okay? You have to appeal to something else, an additional ingredient, basically philosophical reflection. So, again, philosophy of science and science aren't the same thing. Philosophical questions about science can't actually be answered by the sciences themselves, even though, as I mentioned, they require a good understanding of the sciences. So there's lots of philosophical questions about science. We're going to be looking at that in this lecture. These are questions that science itself can't answer, but they're important questions. So here's a scientific question. Does HIV cause AIDS? That's a question that is answered by the sciences, by epidemiologists and by microbiologists and virologists, okay? Here's a philosophical question. Here's a philosophy of science question. What is a law of nature? Okay, not what are the laws of nature. You can ask physicists and chemists for that, like E equals mc squared, force equals mass times acceleration. But rather, what is a law of nature? What is this thing right here? Is this a sentence? Is it something that relates entities with different properties? Is it some sort of abstract object? Do laws of nature themselves have causal powers? Or are they merely just sentences describing the behaviors of objects that have powers? There are famous physicists that thought that laws of nature actually had powers that kind of push things around the world. If you read Isaac Newton, he talked about laws of nature that way. And there are other folks who just said, no, they're just generalizations or sentences, basically, that are approximately true. Anyways, when you're asking these questions, you're engaged in philosophy. So the central questions of the philosophy of science are about science, but they do not belong to science. They are not part of science. So when you're engaged in the philosophy of science, you're not engaged in science, you're doing philosophy. Of course, I'm going to emphasize this. Philosophy is an activity. Scientists can engage in the philosophy of science. And when they're doing that, though, they're not engaged in scientific research, they're engaged in philosophy of science, okay? So scientists engage in philosophy of science all the time, but when they do that, they're philosophizing. They're not, okay? Now, I will say this much, though. Science has become far more specialized today than it was a century ago, even 80 years ago. So due to this specialization of the sciences, many of you are science majors, so you are familiar with this. It means that a lot of scientists today don't really engage in this type of philosophical reasoning about science. But that has nothing to do with the nature of science itself or the nature of philosophy of science. It just has to do with their specialization. And oftentimes they just don't have the training to engage in it. All right, here's another question. This is a science question. What is the amino acid sequence of this protein? That's a scientific question. What is love? That's a philosophy question. Baby, don't hurt me. Should we expand the definition of living beings to include viruses? What kind of question is that? That's actually a philosophy of science question, okay? When biologists propose various definitions of living beings, they're engaged in the philosophy of science. If you read Aristotle's works written 2,300 years ago, Aristotle was you could say he was the first biologist. He wrote numerous works categorizing various entities and stuff, but he wasn't just doing biology, he was doing philosophy of biology when he was proposing various ways to define living things. Okay, so nowadays, if you're taking a class on viruses and you guys are having discussions about are viruses living beings, you're engaging in philosophy of biology right then. Right, okay. And okay, so I will emphasize this though. In many respects, the difference between philosophy and science is one of degree rather than kind. In fact, if you watch my lesson on the definition of science, this will become more apparent, okay? So the boundaries are fuzzy between philosophy of science and science in many respects. Now, does HIV cause AIDS? That's definitely a science question. What is a cause? That's definitely a philosophy question. But there are other cases where it's less obvious what is which, okay? Okay, well, there's other disciplines that study science besides philosophy of science. There's a history of science, there's sociology. In fact, if you honor students, there's a history of science taught by Jim Treffel. It's an awesome class. I recommend taking it if you can. But that's not a philosophy of science class, that's a history of science class. There's sociology of science classes, there's political science, there's psychology of science. And we'll actually be engaged in a little bit of psychology of science in this class. Well, they also ask questions about science, but they ask different questions than the questions that philosophers of science ask. All right, so here's a history of science question. Why did the USSR under Stalin reject Mendelian genetics? Okay. Or here's another one. Why did Germany under Hitler reject Einstein's theory of relativity? When you're asking that question and you're answering it, you're engaged in the history of science. Okay. Why did James Watson underrate the contributions of Rosalind Franklin to the work that led to the discovery of the double helix structure of DNA? Again, that's not a philosophy of science question. That's more history of science or sociology of science. And this answer, I think, was just sexism back in the day. Explain that. Hitler's anti-Semitism explained this. I forget the answer to this question, but it's it's a Google search away. And this is I'm gonna make another claim right now. This is gonna sound arrogant and elitist, but it'll make sense when you think about it. In a sense, philosophy of science has priority over the sociology of science and the history of science and other fields that study science, like psychology of science. Okay. Because these are scientific disciplines. Sociology is a science. History is maybe not, but it uses scientific methods sometimes. Psychology is a science. So when these disciplines study the science, they're using scientific methods in studying science. Like sociologists of science use sociological methods to study the sociology of science. But if you were to scrutinize the effectiveness of the methods that sociologists use, or political scientists, or for psychologists, when investigating science. If you were to say sociologists should study science this way rather than that way, or we're better off doing the psychology of science than the sociology of science. When you do that, when you explore that, when you make arguments to that effect, you're engaged in the philosophy of science, okay, when you're doing that. So it's inescapable. You can't have these other of science fields without the philosophy of science and engaging in philosophical activity. So in that sense, philosophy of science has priority over all these other fields that investigate science. But as we mentioned, there are scientists today, famous ones, celebrity scientists, that dismiss philosophy. They espouse a view that's called scientism, which we're going to look at now. It's the view, well, what is scientism? Scientism is an exaggerated trust in the efficacy of the methods of the natural sciences and it assumes that these methods should apply to all investigations of knowledge. Here's another way. So you should only use, the only way you should explore the world is by using the methods of the natural sciences. And any method of investigation should use those methods, okay? And another way to state scientism is this is the view that science is coextensive with reason itself. So basically, something is rational only if it's scientific, okay? If it's not scientific, it's not rational, okay? So science and like reason itself are one and the same thing. If it's not science, it's not rational. If it's not rational, it's not science. So another way of saying this is the view that the empirical sciences are not only a source of reliable rational knowledge, they're the only source. If a claim about the world does not come from one of these sources, a source that doesn't utilize scientific methods, then that's an irrational and unreliable source, and you shouldn't rely on it, okay? So we're going to explore this view. It's pretty popular. But maybe this is a straw man. Maybe no serious intellectual actually believes in scientism, okay? Because if they're... but, as I mentioned, many scientists do. Here's Neil deGrasse Tyson. My concern here is that philosophers believe they are actually asking deep questions about nature. And to the scientists, it's, what are you doing? Why are you concerning yourself with the meaning of the meaning? So Neil deGrasse Tyson doesn't care much for philosophy of science. Take that, philosophers of science. Here's Stephen Hawking. How can we understand the world in which we find ourselves? How does the universe behave? What is the nature of reality? Where did all this come from? Did the universe need a creator? Most of us do not spend most of our time worrying about these questions, but almost all of us worry about them some of the time. Hawking continues, traditionally, these are questions for philosophy, but philosophy is dead. Philosophy has not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly physics. Scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge. Bam! He is throwing some shade. And then this is Lawrence Krauss, a famous physicist. Krauss writes, philosophy used to be a field that had content, but then natural philosophy became physics, and physics has only continued to make inroads. Every time there's a leap in physics, it encroaches on these areas that philosophers have carefully sequestered away to themselves, and so then you have this natural resentment on the part of philosophers. This sense that somehow physicists, because they can't spell the word philosophy, aren't justified in talking about these things, or haven't thought deeply about them. Krauss continues, this tension between science and philosophy occurs because people in philosophy feel threatened, and they have every right to feel threatened because science progresses and philosophy does not. Mic drop. All right, so here's 3 well-known scientists claiming that basically philosophy, and especially philosophy of science, is kind of useless. Scientists don't need it. How good are the arguments, though? How good are these claims? There's several problems with what Neil deGrasse Tyson, Stephen Hawking, and Lawrence Krauss were claiming. First problem, the claim that science is the only reliable and rational source of knowledge, that's not actually a scientific claim. And it's also not a claim that itself can be proved by scientific methods. Instead, the claim that science is the only and rational source of knowledge is a philosophical claim. And it's defended via the philosophical discipline called epistemology, which is a big fancy word that just means the study of knowledge. Okay, so when these scientists, Krauss, Hawking, Neil deGrasse Tyson, make this claim, they're making an philosophical claim, specifically an epistemological claim. They're making a claim about knowledge. So when they're trying to dismiss philosophy, they're actually doing philosophy themselves. There's a second problem. There is no one definition of science or the scientific methods that applies to all and only sciences and scientific methods. And if you look at the lecture on the definition of science, this will be more apparent. The fact is, there are many non-scientific fields that use similar methods that scientists use, like history. And there are many definitions of science that have been considered throughout the history of science that entail or mean that many pseudosciences would also count as sciences. there are definitions of science that entail that astrology is a science or alchemy is a science, when they're clearly not sciences. Okay? So that's the second problem with scientism. There's a third problem with this view that Neil deGrasse Tyson, Stephen Hawking, and Lawrence Krauss are espousing. Many of the defenses of the reliability of science, in fact, this entire class you're taking right now is in many ways a defense of science. Okay, I'm defending science in this class against a lot of attacks, especially, it's as I record this lecture, it's January 2021, and with the coronavirus epidemic, you've probably seen tons of attacks on science from your, family members and stuff, okay? So I'm defending science in this class. But here's the problem with the view of Hawking, Krauss, and Neil deGrasse Tyson. Many of the defenses of the reliability of science and various scientific methods that we're going to address in this class, when you're defending science, you're engaged in the philosophy of science rather than the specific sciences. If you're defending the use of models by biostatisticians to forecast the COVID pandemic, in some sense, you're doing philosophy of science. But here's the deal. If science and the scientific methods are the only reliable and rational sources of knowledge, then the defenses of science from philosophy are, by the very definition of scientism, unreliable and irrational. Hence, if scientism is true, it's irrational to defend science, since defending science relies on philosophy. In which case, scientism is what philosophers say is self-defeating. It's what if you take a logic class, it's a self-defeating theory. It's like self-contradictory in a sense. If scientism is true, then it's irrational to defend science. So this is like sawing off the branch you're sitting on. It doesn't go well. Scientism does that. It cuts off the branch it's sitting on. In trying to claim that science is the only source of rationality, you give up your ability to defend science against many types of attacks, because when you're doing that, you're engaged in philosophy of science. That's a silly GIF file. All right. So why does science need philosophy? Well, first off, science originated from philosophy. The history of science from the time of the ancient Greeks to the present day is basically the history of philosophy, in a sense, giving birth to one scientific discipline after another. So Euclid kind of developed the science of space, which is geometry. Aristotle, Galileo, Descartes, Leibniz, Newton, the science of physics. Logic was a major discipline. You wouldn't have computer science without logic, and logic is a philosophical discipline. The first logic book was written by Aristotle, and then the Stoic philosophers also developed some of the earliest logic stuff. And in the early 20th century, in the late 19th century, Frege, Russell, and Whitehead, a German philosopher and two British philosophers, kind of took it further. But you would not have computer science today without logic. In fact, computer science students I teach logic as well, and many computer science students take my logic class, and they see it. They can see the connection. Cognitive science a lot of cognitive science came from this philosopher, Jerry Fodor, who just recently passed away, who came up with a theory of mind known as functionalism. And I could go on. But anyways, most science today came from philosophers asking certain questions, and it just kind of turned into a whole field on its own after that. A short lesson about the meaning of the word science. So for a long time, philosophy meant the same thing as science. Science comes from the Latin word sciere, which means to know. Okay? So science just means knowledge. But philosophy, in some sense, meant the same thing. So philosophy means lover of Sophia, knowledge. Sophia means wisdom or knowledge. So philosophy is the love of knowledge, and science is knowledge. So, but when you're engaged in philosophy, you're engaged in science, and vice versa. Many famous scientists engage in the philosophy of science. The only reason scientists today don't engage in philosophy of science isn't because philosophy of science isn't valuable. It's just because science has become incredibly specialized. But that doesn't mean that science does not need philosophy. And here's why. For one thing, philosophy is foundational to science. When scientists are clarifying scientific concepts, they're engaged in philosophical reasoning. In fact, oftentimes on key concepts, scientists will collaborate or rely on philosophers. Concepts like the notion of a gene, studied by genetics, is an example of something like that, or the concept of a cause. Concepts like life, adaptation, gene, function, all over biology, cause, these are ambiguous. They change from one context to another. Take causality. When you claim a virus or a bacterium causes a medical condition, you're assuming a particular definition of a cause that can't be discovered empirically, but is still assumed in scientific practice, okay? Epidemiologists, by the way, acknowledge this. Here's just a sample of various articles by epidemiologists written oftentimes with philosophers on basically the definition of a cause and causal reasoning. And they're relying on the works of philosophers. They realize that, it's one thing to say smoking causes cancer, and it's another thing to say that lockdowns cause viral outbreaks to kind of peter out. One is like the absence of something. The lockdown, in a sense, results in the absence of humans interacting, which causes less transmission. So it's like something that doesn't exist causes some other effect. But in another case, it's an actual entity that exists that causes something else. So there's different notions of cause at play. So this is just an example of how scientists actually, do recognize the importance of philosophical reasoning and the work of philosophers for important concepts in their own work. Other things that science do. Other things that philosophy of science does. So philosophy clarifies the relationship between operational terms, those are terms that are measurable, and then the ordinary language uses of terms. So sometimes scientists speak reductively, as if all there is to a phenomenon is its measurable aspects. Here's a question. What is love? Love is a term that ordinary people use, but psychologists and other scientists might use it as well. So if you ask an ordinary person, they'd be like, hey, you can't define love. Back off, scientist. Whereas a scientist would be like, oh no, you can. Love is measured by a 20% increase in heart rate with the absence of detectable cortisol stress hormones. So when you need to explore the relationship between the way ordinary people talk about love and scientists, in some sense you need to rely on philosophical reasoning. Another way that science needs philosophy, and another way that philosophy is foundational to science, is that philosophy can clarify assumptions and biases that scientists themselves have, and that are just assumed by various scientific disciplines and scientific theories. So scientists are human. They have needs. All scientists, like all humans, have biases. Biases are kind of implicit beliefs you hold that you're kind of not conscious of, that influence other beliefs you have and how you act and stuff, okay? Well, biases threaten various scientific ideals like objectivity, transparency, and rationality. So it's crucial, then, that scientists become aware of these biases. Becoming aware of these biases is crucial to make science free of them, and therefore make science more rational, objective, and transparent. There is one exception, though. Philosophical biases. Science cannot be free of philosophical biases. Well, what are philosophical biases? These are basic, implicit assumptions in science about how the world is. The fancy word for that is ontological. What we can know about the world. The fancy word for that is epistemological. And also, how ought science be practiced? How should scientists go about the research? That's called a normative bias. Well, these philosophical biases influence, justify, and enable scientific practice. That is, these philosophical biases, they're integral to science. You can't have science without views about how the world is, how you can know about the world, and how science ought to be conducted. You can't do science without these. They're integral to it. But since they are biases, they can still skew the development of hypotheses, experimental design, the evaluation of evidence, and the interpretation of results. So what are some examples? Here's an ontological bias. If an experimenter assumes that if they replicate an experimental setup, they'll get the same result. This is a philosophical bias. The reason? It assumes that the world is uniform in its laws. If water freezes here, it'll freeze there at the same temperature. If heavy objects fall here, they'll fall there. If electrons attract each other here, if electrons repel each other here, they'll repel each other on Mars. Another philosophical assumption: objects with similar characteristics will behave in similar ways. Again, you can assume that all geese honk, that all ducks quack, that cows moo, that horses neigh. Why? Because they have similar characteristics. But again, that's a philosophical assumption. And it's actually been one that's been challenged. And we're going to look at that when we look at the lesson on the problem of induction. So again, scientists assume that the world is uniform in its laws. Water always freezes at 32 degrees. Objects always fall when dropped. Electrons repel other electrons. But imagine if the world was not uniform. Instead, one day, imagine that the laws of nature changed without warning. So unbeknownst to everyone, merely high-fiving your friends could cause you to become pregnant. Okay? That would suck in terms of, planning your life. All right. Well, we assume that won't happen because we assume that the world is uniform in its laws. High fives won't suddenly cause pregnancy. What causes pregnancy in the past will cause it in the future. But that's a philosophical assumption. It's specifically a metaphysical assumption, and that is a branch of philosophy. In fact, the first metaphysics book was written by Aristotle. Other metaphysical assumptions. We assume that math applies to the world. You can just, all the laws of physics have mathematical components to them. But how does math apply to the world? How does language apply to the world? That's a philosophical question. Many scientists assume that unobservable entities exist. We have never seen an electron or a quark, but we assume they exist, and we assume that we've detected them in some sense. There's a philosophical component to these assumptions. What are some epistemological biases? Well, epistemology is the branch of philosophy that studies knowledge. Episteme means knowledge, basically, and ology is the study of. Well, here's some epistemological biases that scientists hold. They assume that the world is intelligible, and that it's knowable. That using your senses, you can learn more about reality. Scientists use their senses all the time in the laboratory and in the field. But again, these are epistemological or philosophical biases. Does Dolores know there's a goose if she sees a goose through her binoculars? She's using her sight. Well, an astronomer also uses her sight, oftentimes, but do they know there's a planet if they see a planet? I think that's Saturn. There's also normative biases. These are think of these as like evaluative biases. Okay. What's a good theory? Is it one that's simple? Is it one that has successful predictions? How should science explain things? Should they appeal to laws of nature? Or should they appeal to various types of mechanisms? Well, if you ask a physicist, they might tell you something different than if you ask a microbiologist. Physicists tend to rely more on laws. Microbiologists tend to rely more on mechanisms. Well, how should microbiology explain things? Why should microbiology appeal to something different than physics does in explanations? That's philosophical questions right there. You're engaged in philosophy when you do that. Another way. So again, it's impossible to do science without making philosophical assumptions. But I do note this does not mean that all philosophical assumptions are biases. Sometimes philosophical assumptions are deliberately chosen. For example, what type of model should you use? I'm not talking about fashion models. More like disease models. Hey. Should we have a deterministic or a stochastic climate model? Well, those are deliberate philosophical assumptions that are being made in model design. But in many cases, and I can attest to this just based on personal conversations I've had numerous times with successful, intelligent scientists, many at Mason, that many scientists are flat out unaware of their philosophical biases or how such biases influence their research. So when a philosophical premise is implicitly or unconsciously accepted in a theory, it's a philosophical bias. These are, you kind of learn these without realizing it in your scientific education, in your professional practice, and in other traditions. So with normal biases, awareness is the first step. Like if you have a racial bias, becoming aware of that racial bias is the first step in overcoming it. The problem is, with philosophical biases, these are also fundamental assumptions in science. You can only replace one set of philosophical assumptions with another. So, scientists, basically, they need to understand their philosophical assumptions. This is helpful for revealing competing perspectives, which is crucial for scientific progress. It stops science from being dogmatic, which, we think, one thing you often hear, it's commonly said is, science is successful. One reason is because it's not dogmatic. It's open to new evidence. It follows the evidence wherever it leads. Well, becoming aware of philosophical assumptions is one way to help science from not be dogmatic. Philosophical biases can influence the evaluation of scientific results. So oftentimes, different scientists will look at the exact same evidence or the exact same data, but give different answers and different interpretations of that same exact data. Well, why do they interpret the data differently when they're looking at the exact same data? Oftentimes it's because they have different philosophical assumptions. So that needs to be brought out to the daylight and clarified. And then you can assess and evaluate those philosophical assumptions on the merits of the assumptions along with the empirical data. Philosophy actually is good at formulating new concepts and theories. Okay, so if you've taken psychology classes, you're probably familiar with B.F. Skinner's behaviorism, an outdated view that says, all there is to human behavior is inputs and outputs. You poke someone, they say ouch, that means you're in pain. Well, one of the reasons that behaviorism, psychologists moved from behaviorism to more cognitive theories of behavior, what's actually going on inside the mind kind of counts too, had something to do with philosophy. Philosophy was a big influence on that. So another thing is that there are questions that only philosophy can answer but are important for science. So there are questions that only philosopher can answer, but these are questions that are important for science. For example, what, if any, are the limits to science? What is the definition of science? What is the appropriate domain for a science? So, should we apply economics to psychology? Or should we apply psychology to economics? There is a good bit of interfacing between those two fields, and there's some turf wars and stuff. But in some sense, you need philosophy to kind of mediate and play that role, to say this is a good versus bad application of this to that domain of reality. Can physics explain love? What are numbers? Scientists rely on numbers all the time. What are numbers, though? Have you ever thought about that? What's a law of nature? Are entities or processes more fundamental? This is the debate right now in molecular biology. Are entities like, enzymes more fundamental, or is processes like enzyme catalysis? What's more fundamental? What is time? This is a question that Einstein asked, and he gave an answer to that influenced his special theory of relativity. And spoiler alert, we rely on special relativity for all sorts of stuff. The GPS units on your smartphones are getting data from satellites, they're pinging satellites. So the satellites have to be calibrated according to the laws of special theory of relativity instead of Newtonian laws of physics, or else they'll be off by several hundred meters. Well, you don't get the special theory of relativity without if you read the original paper on the special theory of relativity, which I won't assign to you, don't worry, Einstein offers a definition of time, and then he develops a theory in part based on that. So, again, big connection between philosophy and, GPS. Does natural selection conflict with theism? This was something that was all the rage in the 2000s. Back probably when you were very young. Probably, maybe not even alive yet. But this was all the rage for a while. Should biology be more like physics? So, again, science informs many of the answers to these questions, but it can't answer them. You have to draw on philosophical reasoning as well. And of course, scientists can express views about these questions, but when they do, they're engaged in philosophy. They're not doing science, they're doing philosophy. But that's okay. Philosophy is an activity. It's a discipline, it's a field, it's a body of knowledge or content, but it's also a type of activity. So philosophers also can help foster dialogue between the sciences. Again, economics and psychology both make predictions about human behavior and make assumptions. Well, philosophy can help. And I could rattle off 30 more examples, but I won't. So, additionally, and this is what I'm not going to say more about that in this slide because we're going to be doing that pretty much this entire semester, is philosophy of science can correct misperceptions about science, and in that sense, it can help science. So, when does scientific consensus matter? Climate scientists they estimate that 97%, a few years ago there was a study that showed that 97% of climate scientists agree that human-caused greenhouse gas emissions are causing global warming. So there was consensus on this. Well, why does that matter? Why does just the mere fact that a bunch of scientists agree on something matter? Well, we'll look at that. When does consensus matter and when does it not matter? There are cases where consensus is like definite evidence for scientific views, but then there are other times where there's scientists are in consensus, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't have evidential weight. How should we respond to uncertainties? You probably experienced a lot of that this year with the coronavirus pandemic. What role do values play in science? Science is not free of ethics, and it's not moral value free. It's not neutral. Values play a big role. So we'll address all these questions this semester. The end.